Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfirth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each fortnight we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations with leaders, activists and thinkers from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Welcome back, Curtinistas. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast. My name's Nick Dyrenfirth, the Executive Director of the JCRC, and I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Cos Samaras, JCRC board member and Director of the Redbridge Group. We've got a fantastic guest today, Michael Samaras. No relation, I'm told, so preemptive critics of nepotism can rest easy. Michael is no relation to the great Cos. Michael is a Sydney-based researcher and writer. He first came to my attention in 2022 when he was the man who uncovered the Nazi past of the founding benefactor of the Wollongong Art Gallery. And Michael has written a terrific new book, Anti-Fascists, Jim McNeill and his mates in the Spanish Civil War. This is published by Connor Court. Connor Court also published two of my tomes. I believe, Michael, you might speak to this a little bit later. It was hard work getting the book up with a publisher, and Connor Court came to the party, and I've worked with Connor Court twice, and I think they're, Anthony Capello is a mate of mine. I don't share the same politics as Anthony. I don't think Michael does either, but Anthony is quite ecumenical in the books that he publishes, and in fact, if you look at the publishing scene in Australia, he publishes the most diverse array of authors from the left and, of course, from the right. And I think that a lot of other publishers and self-styled left-wing publishers could do well to take a leaf out of his book. But this is a great, interesting book. It looks at the Australians who fought against Franco in the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, men and women, and they were Australian pioneers against the fight against fascism, which gripped the world from 1939 onwards on a global scale. And Michael, in particular, looks at Jim McNeill, who was a Wollongong steelworker who stowed away in the bottom of a meat ship to get to Europe and joined the famed International Brigades. And one George Orwell was a member of the International Brigades. Michael's book, Anti-Fascists, tells their story, explains why they went off to Spain, what happened to them there, and what became of them after the war. It's been highly praised from leading politicians and authors. Michael Samaras, welcome to Curtin's Cast. It's fantastic to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
And congratulations on the publication of the book. And just so you can confirm to our Curtinistas, our listeners in Australia and globally, you are no relation to the great Cos Kung Fu Samaras.
I'm not related in any way to Cos, and I wish I had $10 for every time someone had asked me that question, because as his fame has risen, I get more queries. Am I related? Is he my cousin or something? But no, he's not.
That's right. It's we're a broad diaspora. That's we all, basically. I think Samaras is equivalent to Smith when it comes to surnames. Michael, look, give us a bit of a background, who you are. You've got an excellent pedigree in talking about these working class Australians who, if you look at their background and just see what they ended up doing in their lives, it's just absolutely mind-blowing. But at the same time, also, your pedigree in digging up some of the more nasty elements within our community. Well, if you're on our side of politics, we consider it nasty. That's been the fascists. So give us a bit of a snapshot.
Well, I mean, I grew up in Wollongong, which is my association with the place. I went to school there, went to university there. But the last 30-odd years, I've been up in Sydney pursuing my career. But a couple of years ago, in fact, during the COVID lockdowns is when I started doing historical research, because I think I couldn't do anything else, We're all stuck at home with time on our hands. And that's when I really started digging into the backstory of Bob Shredder's ass, who was the founding benefactor of the Wollongong Art Gallery. And I established that he was a member of the SD, which is the security service of the SS, and in Lithuania during the war. And the SD was a criminal organisation. That was what Nuremberg tribunals established, and that everyone who was part of it was also, part of a criminal organisation. And you didn't get to be in the SD unless you had some things on your record. So he had a very dark past, and I took that to the art gallery, and after a bit of hesitation, eventually they came good, and through the course of 2022, they removed the plaque, they removed his portrait, they stopped having fundraising dinners in his honour, all of that sort of thing. So I had a great achievement in 2022. By the end of that year, I was very happy with what I'd achieved. But then I started looking around for something else, and I landed on Jim McNeill.
In your family background, though, Michael, Coz's, my family and Coz's family, we're full of left-wing activists, possibly communists, possibly not. Tell us about your background. I'm assuming you're a Greek Australian as well. Is there something about your family background which led you down this path? Interested in researching about fascism, and I think reminding people in contemporary terms that the threat from far right extremism has never quite gone away, and we've been reminded about this over the last decade with the rising right wing, far right populist movements.
Look, in my family, as far as I'm aware, there was no. I should say on my mother's side, where convicts, go back to the 1790s, and I'm not aware of any Labor Party activists or Communist Party members on my mother's side. On my father's side, he was born in 1934, so he was 7 when the Nazis arrived in Greece. Yeah. So he didn't,
he didn't take up arms, but
he was only 7.
That's not his fault.
But that was all part of his experience. That the Nazis occupied Greece for 4 years and starved hundreds of thousands of them to death. He was up in the north, so there were family, there were uncles and so forth who were part of the resistance there. But he was a child and obviously had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, but it's in the blood there. It's in the blood. So tell us, you've been quite modest in terms of your work as regards the Wollongong Art Gallery and, uncovering the Nazi past of its benefactor. And you got a gong for the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, I believe late last year. Is that correct? And you spoke at the Crystal Nacht.
Yes, it was the year before. But yes, that was very gratifying. They recognised the work I'd done and appreciated it, and they presented me with a medal at one of their Crystal Nacht ceremonies. So it was quite an honour, and I deeply appreciated it.
Yeah, and tell us about your sort of working life. I do want to dig deep into this book. I believe you were a Wollongong councillor for a period. So would it be right to describe you as a political animal?
Well, I've been in the Labor Party for 43 years. I've spent time in Young Labor as part of the radical leadership group with one Anthony Albanese.
Stories. Give us some stories. Come on, Mike. Come on.
When we were very young.
We can hit the front page of the newspapers again with an elbow exclusive from his radical past.
I could say that he was a very nice young man, a very good person to work with, and was a natural leader, even when he was like 19 and 20 and 21 when we were doing that. And I was very active in Young Labor, on the executive of New South Wales Young Labor with him. And it was a happy time in my life. So I enjoyed that. I did one term on Wollongong City Council in 91 to 95. And then I've worked in Sydney, a range of corporate roles. I was media manager at Sydney Airport for 5 years. I did the launch of the Westlink M7. I worked for other big corporates. I also did some time as a staffer. I worked for, I think, 3 Labor MPs, left-wing Labor MPs in New South Wales.
Yeah, and so I guess Wollongong shaped you as well. Wollongong steel town, working class town, very strong left-wing tradition, very strong left-wing activism. And I'm assuming that being brought up in that milieu, there's a sort of natural transition to being interested in the Australians that you've written up in this book.
Yeah, Wollongong, of course, a very different place.
You might want to explain to people, we're going to talk about some big events and themes of the 20th century, the Spanish Civil War. We're going to talk about the New Guard in Australia, and we shouldn't assume that listeners know. So just maybe explain the context of Wollongong to our Curtinistas.
Well, certainly when I was growing up, Wollongong was almost like a caricature of an industrial town, a steel town. It had like 22,000 people working at the steelworks, 8,000 coal miners, and all of this in a community of less than 200,000 people. So it was, really was a big company town. BHP sort of dominated the economy and the life of the town. It was, of course, in this post-war, it was where a lot of migrants came to. That's why my father came in 1954, and that's why Shredder's was there in 1950, because all this basically unskilled labour from Europe was pulled in to build the steelworks. And, as it grew and prospered over the 50s, 60s and 70s, and then, of course, they got hit with the steel crisis in the early 80s, just as I was coming of age, just as I was leaving school. And there's now about 2,000 people working in steelworks. So it had this massive economic restructuring. Now the University of Wollongong is much bigger. The health system and tourism, leisure, all of those things are much more important than steel and coal to Wollongong.
Yeah, and very much a union town. I've written one of the histories of the Australian Workers' Union, which is also very much, it was the history of the Federated Iron Workers Association, and the FIA in Wollongong was different. This is the AWU, the FIA regarded as unions of the right of the LP, but in the Gong, very much a left union, very much very radical and activists.
Yes, and the Jim McNeill actually was central to the revival of the FIA in the 1930s. The union had essentially collapsed during the Great Depression. Steelworks had arrived in 1929 from Lithgow, been relocated. Terrible timing because the Depression then clobbered the company. And Jim was central to its revival before he left for Spain. And as you say afterwards, it was controlled by the Communist Party, the FIA, in the 1930s and right up through the 1940s. In the 1950s, the right-wing faction took it, and it was won back by the left in Port Kembla in Wollongong. I think in 1969, the rank and file group took control back. So that's the sort of the potted history of the FIA in the Illawarra.
Oh, yeah, we could spend a whole episode talking about the FIA and Ernie Thornton, the Communist Party of Australia doyen. A lot of this is very familiar to you, isn't it, Cozzy? Very similar story. Your family growing up,
history of Wollongong, is the same as many other sort of industrial towns, isn't it? They've gone through this transformative period now where, you've got a strong history of heavy industry there, and now we're dealing with a totally different economic ecosystem in that city, but right across the entire country. And I think that's probably the broader picture of the country, and that is that you've got these regional cities and towns that once upon a time were quite very blue collar, and now they're becoming largely white collar. And that's having also a political impact, and we could see that right across the country.
Before we get to one of the big question I want to ask you is, how did Jim McNeill, a Wollongong steelworker, stow away on a ship to England and then sort of trek the Pyrenees and fight in the Spanish Civil War? Your argument is that Australians were at the vanguard of the fight against fascism, and maybe you could also tell us about 1920s Australia, or particularly late 1920s Australia, early 1930s, because, many of these sort of titanic sort of struggles were playing out in Australia. And there was an organisation called the New Guard, which I've researched and written about, who are active. And, they were backed by big business, and they were quite a threat to Australian democratic institutions and our way of life.
Perhaps I'll run through Jim's early life if I can,
Sure.
And then we'll get up to that. Jim was born 1900 in Sydney, grew up in Balmain, Rozelle, loses his job in 1927 as the economy starts to turn. The economy was difficult in the late 20s before it absolutely collapsed into the Depression. But that's when he began his political life, really. He joined the Industrial Workers of the World.
The Wobblies, yep.
Called the Wobblies, IWW, or the Wobblies. And his first action actually was to go to Adelaide with his great friend Ted Dickinson, and they were in a free speech fight. On a Sunday afternoon, everyone would go down to the Botanic Park in Adelaide, and people would climb up onto tree stumps and make speeches. And there was a Labor Party ring, a trade union ring, and the Wobblies were being refused permission, but they wouldn't accept that. They just got up and spoke anyway. They'd get charged, arrested, and refused to pay the fines, go to jail. So they ran this campaign of civil disobedience, Jim and Ted, to be allowed to speak. It's one of the first things they do, and they win it, with some creative tactics in the courtrooms and so forth. And then the Depression starts to really hit in Adelaide, gets really bad, and there's unemployment rises, and Jim and Ted become leaders of a campaign for a better deal for the unemployed, because at that point, of course, there's very little in the way of welfare state, and the unemployed are really getting a rough treatment. And that's really, I think, where a lot of his politics comes from, the real scarring effects of mass unemployment, which was just so terrible for people, sleeping on the banks of the rivers and in sort of railway depots and so forth. The extent of the poverty and the despair about it is just so horrible for men like Jim and Ted. Ted is actually jailed. They start a newspaper, incredibly. They're both unemployed, but they start their own newspaper, which gets them into all sorts of strife because of some of the articles that they write. Is basically the establishment in Adelaide. Is this direct action,
or is this another? Because the Wobblies publication was direct action.
Yes, it had been suppressed during the First World War. Jim and Ted revive it, and so they keep the title as direct action. And Ted is charged as the editor with sedition and is sentenced for 6 months jail, actually, for newspaper articles, which is, people talk about freedom of speech these days, free speech warriors, but, get real. People getting sentenced to jail for 6 months for a newspaper article in Adelaide, quite extraordinary. When he's released, Ted leaves for England, and he eventually goes to Spain. We can talk a bit more about Ted. And that's when Jim comes back to Sydney, back to New South Wales, and is soon involved in confronting the New Guard on the streets of Sydney. There's wild brawls. There's the New Guard is this right-wing...
Led by Francis de Groot, former soldier.
He was the one who did the opening of the Harbour Bridge.
Yes.
That's right.
Actually led by Eric Campbell, who was...
yes.
And they're quite assertive, right-wing, nationalistic, militaristic, just fairly terrible people. Their main activity actually appears to be disrupting public meetings and trying to suppress free speech again. And they have flying squads that drive around suburban Sydney and regional areas, including the Illawarra, basically trying to stop people having their public meetings.
Very similar tactics to the brown shirts in Germany about the same time.
Correct. It's the Australian phenomenon of that same thing.
Yeah, there's particularly in Sydney, there used to be that they would head to working class areas where, they knew there was Labor and also Communist Party strongholds, and these people were thugs. They used to take pleasure in bashing Reds.
Yes, that's right. It was to suppress public discussion. Because again, this is all before TV, radio, and internet, and so forth. So to people on a Friday night would just go down the shopping centre, and the speakers would stand up literally on soap boxes or fruit boxes and speak, and street oratory was the entertainment and the way of getting ideas out and about. And that's what the New Guard was, disrupting and suppressing.
It's extraordinary that we often forget in this modern world that back then it was actually working class people with hardly any money, any financial, social capital, who actually were the ones who were creating these political movements. To start off a newspaper, basically you're unemployed, and you I mean, did Jim have any education? Like, what's the full extent? Did he finish primary school?
They finished primary school. That was basically it.
Yeah.
So they'd have 6 or 7 years of schooling. They'd leave when they were 12 or 13. But yes, their resourcefulness is what I really admire about them. The determination to do things and not be passive. They were active men. They took agency. And even though they were unemployed, they had nothing, they would cobble together enough money somehow to, sometimes from unions, sometimes from people in Broken Hill would send them money. They would start their own newspaper.
Something to be said about that entire generation. Jim's probably a little bit older than the sort of generation I'm thinking of, which is that sort of the great generation, which is the individuals in their 20s who fought the Second World War, but even those who obviously took extraordinary actions in the 1930s. Something to be said about them all. I mean, my grandfather is very similar in this space, and I spoke a little bit about him at your book launch, where you think about it, like he's a refugee from a mass exodus of Greeks from Asia Minor. He doesn't go to school. I think he's probably spent two years maximum at school. Grows up to be a communist activist, very well versed in political doctrine, all self-taught. Goes to northern Greece to fight the Germans as a partisan. Does all these things which you think that's extraordinary things for these working class people who normally, as I said before, in today's world, we just think, oh, you've got to go to university to be politically aware. It's not necessarily the case.
Oh, absolutely not. These guys were determined, committed, politically conscious people. So after the New Guard, dissipates, after Jim's involved in he's on the front page of the Daily Telegraph in Sydney fighting the New Guard. Then he's down in Wollongong trying to revive the FIA. And that's when when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936. The word is put out through the Communist Party in 1938 that, volunteers are invited. That's when Jim decides to go to Spain.
Can we take a step back, Michael? We assume that people know, what was at stake in the Spanish Civil War. And again, we could spend multiple episodes talking about the why and the what of the Spanish Civil War. But, it's complex. On the Republican side, it's a motley coalition, a motley alliance.
Yes, it is an alliance. The Spanish Republic government that comes to power in the beginning of 1936 is a coalition, all sorts of parties represented there. But the war actually starts in July 1936 when essentially the right wing refuses to accept the election result that they'd been defeated in February 1936, and there's a coup is launched in July. And straight away, it's sort of frustrated and defeated by people in the streets, by popular resistance. Hitler and Mussolini come straight to the assistance of the rebels, and that's when the war actually, what was meant to be a short, sharp, violent seizure of power through a coup, is frustrated, and then there's Hitler and Mussolini come in to help them, and that's when the war begins. It starts as a coup, turns into a war, and it lasts until March, April 1939. And it's a terrible war. Over 500,000 people will die, most of them Spaniards. We're talking about the International Brigade, of course, but most of the people, it's an important point to remember that most of the people who fight and die in this war are going to be Spaniards.
And the thing about I think for our listeners, not many would know that the Germans really sharpened their tools of trade in that civil war. I mean, the Condor Legions, isn't it? The
Condor Legion. So some of the iconic weapons of World War II, like the 88mm artillery piece, the gun, and the Stuka.
Yep.
Yeah, they're all tried and tested in Spain. The Hitler and Mussolini use it as practice ground, proving ground for their weapons and their tactics. So that's why you get the destruction of Guernica, which is by the Luftwaffe and the Italian Air Force, which is just a prelude to what's going to happen to all sorts of cities over Europe within just a few years.
That's right. When the Germans then decide to go on the offensive first in Poland, then in France, the Allies were coming up against an army that's already been in the field for about 4 years.
Yes, the numbers are quite extraordinary. The Germans sent between 17 and 20,000 people. The Mussolini sends about 70 to 80,000.
That's right.
So, and at the same time, this is an important point, the Western democracies, Britain and France, will not assist the Republic, will not assist a fellow democracy. In fact, they do worse than that. They put an embargo and non-intervention policy on. So no one the Republic can't buy arms to defend itself, whereas the Germans and the Italians are sending, men and arms, material to aid Franco, the fascists. The International Brigades, we should explain, are basically volunteers from around the world who go to assist the Republic when the democracies refuse to assist. So you have the governments of France and Britain and America standing aside, and in that vacuum, you have volunteers like Jim, and there's 35,000 of them who come to assist the Republic, and they formed up through the Communist Party as the International Brigades.
And they're quite a diverse bunch as well, aren't they, Michael? I mean, you've got George Orwell's probably the most famous volunteer. He's a democratic socialist, but you've got anarchists there, you've got Trotskyists. On the flip side to Nazi Germany's involvement, the Soviet Union come in on behalf of the Republic.
Yes, an important point I should mention is that George Orwell wasn't in what's technically regarded as the International Brigades. He was in the POUM militia, the POUM being a Marxist but non-Stalinist faction. And it has its own.
He was quite critical of elements of the Republic, the alliance.
Although people will have read his book Homage to Catalonia, yes, which is a very famous, wonderful, brilliant book that everyone should read. But I often tell people, don't let that be the only book you read on Spain. In fact, don't let it be the only thing by Orwell on Spain, because 4 or 5 years later, he writes a very important essay which revises a lot of the things he says in that, because in that he basically suggests that the divisions within the Republican side going to cause defeat. And in his essay, he revises that and says, the divisions weren't the cause of the defeat. The cause of defeat was we didn't have enough guns and tanks and bombs and aircraft and so forth.
The West's reluctance.
Yes, that's right.
To assist. Basically, they allowed a volunteer army and Spanish civilians to push back against a military-industrial complex which Germany was producing.
Yes, that's basically true.
So tell us about the Australian contribution then to the brigades. Jim McNeill, his mate Ted Dickinson. There was around 70 Australians who went on to fight the good fight.
Yeah, we don't know the exact number, but around 65 to 70 is pretty well in the mark. They were essentially people of the broad left. Many of them were Communist Party members, but not all of them. Ted Dickinson was not a member of the Communist Party. In fact, he used to mock the Communist Party as being a comical party full of tin pot Lenins, is one of the things that the Wobblies criticised them for. But Jim was, by this point, he had joined the Communist Party during the Depression.
Lance Sharkey is secretary at this point in time, is that right?
No, the secretary is J.B. Miles.
Miles, that's right.
Sharkey follows Miles. I mean, many of them are working class men. There are women who go as nurses, doctors, translators, PR people and so forth, but most of the people who go are working class men. Many of them are wharfies or seamen because they have the ability to get to Spain. Some of them worked their way to Europe on boats and so forth. Jim decided to go in 1938, and he left Wollongong in March 1938. He has no money, so he can't just buy a fare. So he ends up in Melbourne and is stowed away on a ship called the Melbourne Star. It takes about 5 weeks to get to Europe, and he's down in the bottom, in the very bowels of the ship, sitting in pitch black darkness for 16 hours a day. He has an arrangement with some of the seamen that he can come out and sleep in a bed and sort of get some food, but then he has to go back into this hole, basically down near the screws of the ship, in pitch black. It was like solitary confinement. He emerges 5 weeks later very haggard and
not the greatest preparation for going into battle.
No, exactly, because when he gets to Paris, they check him. They send him off to be checked by the doctors, and the doctors refuse to say, you're okay to go on. He's held back in Paris, and they try and feed him up before he's sent on, and he has to walk over the Pyrenees, trek over the top of this mountain range to get into Spain. He does that, and he manages to get there, and is put straight into training. Trains at a beautiful little town called Mont Blanc, which I went to. I went to Spain as part of my research for this. A beautiful little town west of Barcelona. And then he goes into battle in the Battle of the Ebro, which was the Republic's last throw of the dice, really, in the war, as they tried to push the fascists back. And they get to a point called Hill 481, and that's where they're held. And the International Brigade and the Republic can't get any further. Hill 481 seems to have been a terrible, terrible battle. That's where 2 Australians die, that Jim's friends, Bill Morcom and Bill Young, both die on 481. They're just being attacked by the Germans. By this time, the aerial power of the Germans and the Italians is really being brought to bear, and it proves decisive. The Republicans just don't have enough weapons. They've got very, very little in the way of air power, very little in the way of artillery. And as brave and courageous as people like Jim are, that you can't win a war with courage and bravery. You actually win a war with tanks and artillery and fighter bombers.
Yeah, it's real David and Goliath stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it's extraordinarily brave, but I mean they're doomed. They just do not have the material needed to win a modern war. Jim is actually injured on the last day that the International Brigades fight. He's taken off to hospital, and he's reported as missing, believed killed. So back in Wollongong, the news comes back that he's dead. So his family for 6 weeks think he's dead. It's must have been extremely tough on everyone. Eventually, they find out that he's alive when he sends them a letter himself saying, "I'm in hospital. I've got, I could walk. I'm okay. I can hobble around with 2 sticks." Unfortunately, his friends, Bill Young and Bill Morcom, don't come back from the Battle of the Ebro. Another guy who he was friendly with, who'd gone with him from Wollongong, Joe Carter, he's also injured but survives. But his great friend, Ted Dickinson, had been killed earlier in the war. He'd been killed in the Battle of Jarama, which was one of the early battles fought in February 1937, when the International Brigade was thrown into the line to stop Madrid being encircled by the fascists. And that they're barely. I mean, at this point, the International Brigade has just been formed, and Ted's fighting with the British and the British battalion, and they've just been dock workers, miners, clerks, the month before, and then suddenly they're thrown into battle. It's a total slaughter, a very difficult experience for them. But Ted is actually in the machine gun company, which is captured by the fascists at that battle. And they're marched 400 metres down behind the lines, and Ted is pulled out of the line and executed. And the eyewitness accounts that I've put in the book show that he died a very brave death. He would, undaunted to the end, he was giving the salute and wishing his mates all the best for what was to follow. And one says that he died with a smile on his face. He was refused to be cowed by the fascists.
Yes, and the fascists went on. Franco and co went on to terrorise Spain for several decades, and hunt down perceived enemies. McNeill comes back to Australia. He's welcomed with a marching band and a mayoral reception in Wollongong, and for want of a better phrase, he's a bit of a glutton for punishment, and he's definitely a rebel because in 1939 he ignores the CPA, the Communist Party's line on supporting the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, and he volunteers for the second AIF, the second Australian Imperial Force, to fight fascism again in Europe. Amazing.
He is. I think it's one of his finest moments, actually.
And he's 39 by then, so not a young man.
And in fact, to get in, he lies. He tells them he's 33. So he's determined to go, and that does signify a real break with his party loyalty, because the Communist Party had grown strongly through the 1930s in Australia. In about 1930, it only had a couple hundred members. By 1939, it's got a couple of thousand. So it's had sort of a tenfold growth. It's also won control of the FIA, the coal miners' unions, big influence in the Siemens and the Warfares, the teachers and the clerks. So it's had spectacular growth, all underpinned really by anti-fascism, because it had been the staunchest, most strident, most strongest opponent of fascism. But then in August 1939, Hitler, Stalin do their deal in Europe, and the Communist Party of Australia just flips on a dime, and suddenly is opposed to the war that Australia is now in September, where Australia is at war with Nazi Germany, with the fascists, and the Communist Party says, "Oh, this is a terrible war. It's an anti-imperialist war. We're anti-imperialist. This is just an imperialist war. We have to oppose the war with all our strength."
And then flips again a couple of years later.
That's right. Barbarossa comes and they flip again and become the strongest war party in Australia. But Jim just ignores them. I mean, this is he's truly, I think, the finest moment that proves that he is a genuine anti-fascist, because as soon as recruiting opens in Wollongong, he's down there straight away and is enlisted and goes to war, goes back to Europe. In fact, on the Queen Mary, not stowed away. It goes back on the Queen Mary with the second AIF, and he's one of the first people to enlist in Wollongong. And as I say, to get in, he has to lie, because they're saying that they want men aged between 20 and 35. He's almost 40 at this stage, so he drops his age by 6 years because he's determined to go, and he does, and sails off in 1940. To help defend Britain from what they believe is going to be the invasion. Invasion doesn't happen. He stays in Europe. He's in fact sent off to Scotland, because he does have health problems at this point. So they don't send him off to fight El Alamein and Tobruk. They actually send him to Scotland to do with the First Australian Forestry Company, which is a whole other story, which people probably don't know about, the number of Australians who in the Australian Army who do forestry for Britain. Getting timber, because Britain got all its timber from Sweden before the war, and suddenly with the war it's all cut off. So what does Britain do? It's desperate for timber, and you need so much timber when you're fighting a war for all sorts of reasons, packing bridges and repairing your buildings that have been destroyed in the Blitz. So Britain's got surging demand for timber and has lost its supply, so it has to instantaneously create a forestry industry, which is what it does. It pulls in all these Australian, Canadian and New Zealand timber specialists, and they're all they're in the army, but they're working in the forests, and that's what Jim does.
Was he ever deployed into combat?
No, he spends they have to do training. They're part of the army.
Yeah, that's right.
So they do their training and they have exercises and drills and all of that, but he doesn't fire a shot in anger, no.
Probably lucky he didn't end up in Alamein or Tobruk, to be frank.
Well, that's where most of the rest of his unit went.
Yeah, pretty rough. Pretty rough. The first initial contact that the Australian forces had with the Germans was not a good one.
No, it was pretty tough. And but he's having health issues by this point because of his experiences in Spain. He was, injured and half starved in Spain. So he's some of the time he's in hospital. I mean, he's in hospital when they're sailing off to the Middle East, and then he's sent up to Scotland.
So does he make it? He comes back to Australia?
He does, and he maintains his loyalty to the Communist Party throughout the post-war years. And thanks to Asia, we have a very good sense of what he got up to in the post-war years, because they're keeping tabs on him throughout the 1950s and 1960s. He has a family. He has a daughter who he's met and married an English woman in Scotland, and they have a daughter in Scotland. And then they come back and they're part of the explosion of the Western Sydney booming suburbs in the post-war years. He's part of that. His main activity appears to have been just selling Tribune. He stood in front of the Guildford Hotel for about 25 years every Friday night and sort of Saturday afternoon selling Tribune. Very dedicated, loyal member of the Communist Party, right up until 1968 when the Soviet Union invades Czechoslovakia, and he's very shattered by that. It sort of breaks all his illusions. And one of the quotes I have from an interview he gave talks about how he'd been sucked in by the Soviet Union for years and years and years. So he has to deal with sort of the death of his dream in the last years of his life. And he's also very dedicated to the memory of his friend Ted Dickinson. He spends a lot of his sort of free time writing articles about Ted, telling people about Ted. He wanted people to remember Dickinson and his courage and heroism. He never forgot him, and he writes articles that are published in the Miners' Federation magazine, Common Cause, all about what a great guy Ted Dickinson was. He doesn't talk about himself so much, Jim. He's a very modest man, humble, working class.
I'm assuming he's not a member of the RSL.
I don't know about the RSL, but he was very proud of his service. He did march on Anzac Day. He was an Australian patriot as well as an Australian communist. He didn't see that there was contradiction there. He was committed to memorialisation of the International Brigades, and he dies in 1976.
And you're big about the memorialisation and remembering these Australians who are the vanguard of the fight against fascism. As you point out, nearly 1 million Aussies serve in the fight against Germany, fascist Italy, fascist Japan. But McNeill and his mates in the International Brigades, they were the first to fight the fascists. As we've just heard, McNeill went back, but they're not honoured. And part of that is because, they were ignoring Australian government directives to go off and fight in Spain when the policy was a policy of appeasement. And one of the things we haven't been able to talk about today is, the Spanish Civil War was really complex for the Labor Party as well. Maybe we'll get you back and have another conversation about that. But, they're not honoured in the Australian Memorial, and you think that there should be some form of official recognition beyond tributes at Trades Hall and other unofficial recognition of their noble and courageous fight against fascism.
Of course, now it's all about memorialisation. But when they came back, and many of them had suffered terrible injuries, and because they weren't recognised as doing the right thing, they didn't get any assistance. They didn't get pensions or provision of that sense, of that practical sort that helped people who'd been to war. Now, of course, they're all long dead. It's how they're remembered, and certainly the Australian War Memorial does not acknowledge them because they weren't part of Australian Defence Forces, even though they were the first Australians to fight and die in cases against fascism. They're not recognised at all, even though they were were they prescient or premature anti-fascists? Because within months of Jim coming back, the government has declared war on fascist Germany, and we're all, the whole resources of Australia are being mobilised to fight fascism, and the people who'd done it on their own account are just ignored. That was really why I wrote the book. I wanted to believe these people should be honoured because of what they did with no resources, actively discouraged by their government. They knew what was right and what was wrong, and they were prepared to put their lives on the line. And through extraordinary, effort, they did. They went and they got to Spain, which was a big, an ordeal for many of them. And then they suffered and fought, and many of them died while they were there.
So apart from buying your fine book, Michael, what can ordinary and learn about the lives of these Australians? What would you encourage our Curtinistas, our listeners, and other Aussies who are interested in this theme and think that these people should be honoured in some way?
Well, yes, read the book is great personal interest. But the other thing I'm telling people is, ask your library to buy the book, because, the people who won't be able to buy the book should have access to it. So I'm a big supporter of libraries. I'd love to see the book get acquired. In Melbourne last year, there was a memorial to the International Brigade opened at Trades Hall. But there's nothing in Sydney. There's nothing in Brisbane. There's nothing in Perth or Adelaide for them. And many of them came from these places. They should be remembered. And, internationally, they get much more recognition than they do in Australia. People like Hemingway, wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls for them. Benjamin Britten wrote a symphony for them, Ballad of Heroes, it's called. They're remembered in popular culture. The captain in The Dirty Dozen is an International Brigader. And most famously, the Humphrey Bogart character in Casablanca is an International Brigader. So internationally, when you want to depict courage and sacrifice, International Brigades are where you go. In Australia,
I think it's a particularly, there's the very memorable speech given by Hilary Benn a few years ago in the House of Commons when talking about whether the UK should intervene in Syria and Iraq in the fight against ISIS. And it's one of the things which strikes me about the speech is when he talks about the internationalist tradition of UK Labor and the International Brigade, they're front and centre in a House of Commons speech. And it's something which is missing in Australian discourse, particularly discourse on the left in Australia.
Well, it's interesting to compare and contrast the reaction of the British Labor Party and the Australian Labor Party to this war in Spain, because Attlee, once it became clear that non-intervention was a sham and a farce, Attlee was a very staunch defender of the Spanish Republic. He actually went to Spain during the war and addressed the International Brigaders. He wrote articles, praising the Republic and making it clear which side he was on. And when they came back to Spain, he was the one who welcomed them at the train station. And in Australia, John Curtin, who had the same position as Attlee, as the leader of the Labor Party, he never said a word. Curtin was silent throughout the entire thing, throughout the entire conflict. Other members of the Labor Party, of course, were supportive, but officially the Labor Party didn't have did not say anything. Why that is the case is, it's hard to pin it down when someone doesn't say anything about a conflict. But I suspect it had two reasons. I offered two explanations for the silence in any event in the book. One is that Curtin himself was a pacifist. He was been so scarred by the horrors of the First World War that he was, had retreated to pacifism, and it was part of his greatness, in fact, as he has to grapple with the reality of the war, of the world as it is in the 30s and 40s, and becomes a great wartime leader. So a pacifist transitioning to a wartime leader is not without an emotional cost, I think, and some of that, it may explain his silence on Spain. The other thing, of course, is
it's a fractious Labor Party in the 1930s. He has to hold together. People think, it was the party had been split in three over the response to the depression. And I think, as you point out, there were many Australian Catholics who, they had, complex attitudes to what was going on in Spain, to put it mildly.
That's right. So, as you say, the depression had overwhelmed the Australian Labor Party. It had collapsed basically into three, and Curtin's job as the leader was to try and rebuild it. And so I suspect he must have been very wary of saying anything in Spain that would antagonise a very large Catholic faction within the Labor Party.
We might leave it there, Michael. It's been fantastic and riveting to discuss your super important book, Anti-Fascists, Jim McNeill and his mates in the Spanish Civil War. It is available directly from Connaught Publishing.
And should be in bookshops.
And it will definitely be in bookshops. Readings is my publisher of choice, and it should be there. Should be there. The new International Bookshop. I urge people to go out there and grab a copy of this tome. Grab 2, grab 3 for your mates. Michael, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Kung Fu Cos Samaras, thank you too. And we will see you next week for a new episode of Curtin's Cast.